So thank you very much for your invitation. So I am Anaïs Tabeling. I work at the European Commission for DG Grow. I wish I had been there with you in Berlin. I like very much Berlin, but well, the European Commission is trying to cut off its impact also on the environment, and so there are very now the business trips are very limited. So this is a concrete example of what the European Commission is trying to do for the environment. But of course, today what we are going to talk about is what the European Commission requests company to do, and namely, we are going to talk about finance and biodiversity at the European level. So, in CSDD, Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence, in CSRD, Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, and in taxonomy. So, just let's have a look on my plan. First, I will talk very quickly about the general political context. Then I will talk about CSDD, so Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive. So this is the proposal on which I am currently working in DG Grow. So the proposal I know the best. It's an horizontal and operative instrument. The proposal was published in February and is now under negotiations. It's also for companies the most ambitious and the most demanding instruments. Then the third point will be dedicated to CSRD, so Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive. This is a reporting instrument. The proposal was published last year, is now under trilogue, and we hope it will be adopted soon. And finally, I will talk about taxonomy, so the classification instrument, which is already in force. So as you can already see, these three instruments or instruments to be are very much linked. And I will begin, so as I said, by the political context, which is common to the three instruments. So the political context is this one. So these three texts are at the core in the part of the political priorities of the Commission, namely the Green Deal and an economy that works for people, and it links to many strategies of the commission, like the biodiversity strategy or other strategies that you can see here. What is important to say is that there was a strong call from stakeholders um, for these three instruments, so to adapt the European and the finance and the European economy to the environmental challenges. And in particular, concerning CSDD, so the due diligence proposal, there was a call from the European Parliament, a resolution, and also a call for the Council to take action. So now I will come to CSDD, so Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the horizontal instruments. This proposal of directive builds on the international voluntary frameworks that I guess you know very well, so OECD guidelines, UNGPs, and ILO declarations. These voluntary frameworks have been used by many companies for around 10 years. It's a very positive movement, yet it's not enough. It's not. It's also too uneven, depending on sectors, and this is why, given that the challenges we face, a mandatory instrument was needed. What did we have in mind when designing the scheme? What were our considerations at the Commission? Well, first, we want to spread a culture of no harm in the value chains. Second, we want to ensure defragmentation in the single market. And here I refer, of course, to the fact that there are already two laws existing in Europe, in France and in Germany. We want to ensure consistency. Today, we talk about CSRD and taxonomy, but I'm sure you're aware that there are other instruments that are linked to due diligence, like deforestation, timber, conflict minerals, batteries, and also coming instrument, for example, on forced labor. We want to ensure legal certainty, transparency. Proportionality is very important for us. We want these obligations to be workable for companies. Companies are subject to an obligation of means, not an obligation of results. And finally, we want to ensure collaboration. Let's come now to the personal scope. So, which companies are concerned by this CSDD proposal? Who is in the scope? So, as you can see here, both European and non-European companies are concerned. There are special conditions for non-European companies. I will not enter into the details unless you have some questions later. So, and as you can see, for European companies, around 13,000 companies in Europe are concerned by the proposal. And for non-European companies, around 4,000 companies, non-European companies, are in the scope. So these 13,000 non-European companies, they represent around 1% of all European companies, but actually this company, they produce more than 50% of the turnover in Europe. So they have a huge impact on value chains. These companies, they are split into two groups, as you can see on the left of the slide. So the group one concerns the bigger company, the larger companies with 500 plus employees operating in all sectors. And the group two concerns companies which are smaller inside, but which have a bigger impact because they operate in high impact sectors. And I will come to the high impact sectors now, which are them. Well, they are garment and footwear, agriculture, and minerals. How did we choose these high impact sectors? Well, we chose them according to different surveys, both European and American surveys. So now, given your topic, I propose a small zoom on financial undertakings, just to precise that financial undertakings are in the scope of the proposal if they meet the thresholds of group one companies. So only if they are large companies, because in our proposal, the financial sector is not considered as a high impact sector. They are in the scope, but because we want to ensure the access to credit, especially for SMEs, there are some adaptations in the proposal concerning value chain and some obligation. Now, I would like to talk about the material scope of the proposal, which is what are concretely companies requested to do in our proposal. What are their due diligence obligations? Well, first, what I have to precise is that we ask companies to act, to perform due diligence obligation in their value chain. And when we talk about value chain in our proposal, it's not only the upstream value chain, which some people call the supply chain, but it's also the downstream value chain. So this is a very, very ambitious definition of the value chain. Now, concerning human rights and environmental arm, we ask company to to avoid human rights and environmental adverse impacts. And to do so, we ask them to respect and to comply with international prohibition or obligation coming from international conventions. And in that, we took inspiration from the German law, which refers to also international conventions. Um, I will also propose you a little zoom on biodiversity. So you will see that in the annex of our proposal, and in the annex you have the references of these international conventions. There are some provision about biodiversity. So in particular, the Nagoya Protocol, Cartagena Protocol, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the CITES Convention. And also in the part one of the annex, which is dedicated normally to human rights, there is also part of the prohibition, the violation of the prohibition of causing any measurable environmental degradation, such as, for example, deforestation. So biodiversity is really taken into account in our proposal. Now, how do concretely companies respect these environmental and these human rights conventions? Well, there are two kinds of obligations: obligation for companies on the left of the slide, and obligation for directors on the right. So, what do have companies to do? They have to perform the due diligence obligations as described in the OECD. So these are the 6 steps of the OECD. You can see them on this slide made by OECD, I must precise. So in the center, the first step, embedding, and then clockwise, identifying adverse impacts, seizing, mitigating adverse impact, tracking, communicating, and providing for cooperation. Concerning communication, I would like to precise now that there are not provision dedicated to communication in our proposal, but only a reference to CSRD. So it's in CSRD, so the reporting directive that companies will have to report about due diligence. So first part of the obligation of the company, the due diligence 6 step from OECD. And then another part is the climate change obligation. So below on the slide, so group one companies, which mean the larger companies, they have to adopt a plan to ensure that their business strategy is compatible with the Paris Agreement. Now let's come to the duties for directors on the right of the slide. So directors have two kinds of duties. First, they have to set up and oversee the due diligence processes. And second, they have a general duty of care. So when fulfilling their duty to act in the best interest of the company, they have to take into account the human rights, climate change, and environmental consequences in the long term. Now, let's see what happens. What happens if companies don't comply with these obligations? Well, there are some public and private enforcement measures in the proposal. On the left, there is a complaint proceedings. This is one of the last step actually of the OECD guidelines. So internal complaint mechanisms set up by the company. Then there is, like in the German law, an administrative supervision with member state authorities, a complaint mechanism sanction, and there will be a European network of supervisory authorities. And then on the right, and this is not in the German law, but in the French one, there is a civil liability regime. Now, just to conclude on CSDD, I will add that the Commission is aware that this proposal lays off new obligation for companies that can be difficult to implement. That's why there is a support toolbox that is provided for in the proposal. And one of the challenges for companies will be also to implement the different instruments that will be in force. And as you can see, they're linked, so we must help them to avoid double work, and in particular, double work between CSDD and CSRD. So let's talk now about CSRD, so Corporate Stability Reporting Directive. This is a reporting instrument proposal published in 2021 in trilogue, as I said. So what is this proposal? This is a mandatory European sustainability reporting instrument. This is actually an amendment to the accounting directive of 2014, and this follows the NFRD, non-financial reporting directive. So in this proposal, companies are requested to disclose information, so it's a disclosure instrument, on the way they operate and manage social and environmental challenges. It's supposed to help investors, civil society, and consumers to evaluate the non-financial performance of large companies and encourage these companies to develop a responsible approach to business. In CSRD, there is also a special provision on biodiversity and ecosystem. And the exact content of this obligation will be later described in reporting standards. So the companies in scope of CSRD, a large company, so plus 500 employees, and also listed SMEs from 200, 500 employees. So this being said, the scope is in discussion in the trilogue. So main things that are discussed during the trilogue are the scope, the group-based approach, and also whether non-EU companies should be included in the scope. I told you before that it was the case for CSDD, and in CSRD, this is very much discussed. Now, CSRD is not the only European instrument which aims to foster transparency. And namely, of course, it is also the objective of the taxonomy regulation. So taxonomy. Taxonomy is a classification instrument. It was the first proposal that was published, and it's the only instrument that is enforced, um, although we are still waiting for a delegated act. So taxonomy, it's a classification system, it's a measuring tool, and it's also a transition tool to a neutral um, climate impact. So on this slide made my colleagues in FISMA, you can see very, very clearly what is taxonomy and what it is not. So on the left, what is taxonomy? Classification system, a tool to help investors and companies, a tool which reflects technological and policy developments, which facilitates transition, technology neutral, and which foster transparency. And what is taxonomy not? It is not a mandatory list to invest in. It is not rating of the greenness of company. It does not make any judgment on the financial performance of an investment. And what is not green is not necessarily bad for the environment. In taxonomy, there are six environmental objectives, and you can see on the right below that the protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems is included in the objective, and it's in Article 15 of the regulation. And of course, as usual in taxonomy, there will be a delegated act to establish the technical screening criteria. So how to be considered as a sustainable activity? Well, here are the four basic conditions. You have to, your economy, your activity have to substantially contribute to at least one of the six environmental objectives, the ones that we just saw. Plus, you have to do no significant harm, what they call DNSH, so do not significant harm to any of the other five environmental objectives. And you have also finally to comply with minimum safeguards. And these minimum safeguards are actually a reference to OECD guidelines, UNGP, and also ILO. And as I said before, OECD, this minimum safeguard, OECD, UNGP, and ILO are actually also the inspiration, the basis inspiration of CSDD. So I began with these safeguards, with these guidelines, and I will finish also on them. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anaïs Tabeling. Thank you.